The night the story began, few people in America were paying attention to Africa. Most eyes were fixed on the growing concerns at home. Harvests were shrinking. Export deals were falling apart. Farmers in the Midwest were watching markets they depended on slip out of reach. In towns across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, families who had worked the land for generations felt a quiet worry settling in. They knew something was changing, and not in their favor. But on that same night, far away in Burkina Faso, something very different was taking shape. On the dry Sahel plains, a farmer in the small community of Koudougou knelt beside a clay bowl filled with seeds his grandmother had saved before she passed. These were not modern hybrids. They were family seeds, carried from one generation to the next. As he prepared the soil for planting, he whispered a single word that held the weight of memory and purpose: belonging. Scenes like this may feel familiar to anyone who grew up in a community where land and family were tied together. When control over seeds and harvests slips away, people lose more than income. They lose identity. They lose choice. They lose the sense that their hands can shape their own future. For many viewers who understand how fragile stability can be, this is where the story begins to matter. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, let your thoughts stay with this message. Sometimes simply listening is an act of respect. What happened next was not just policy, it was a turning point. Burkina Faso announced a $900 million anti-GMO seed law, a decision bold enough to draw immediate attention from Washington, Brussels, and powerful corporate boardrooms across the West. Overnight, conversations about Africa shifted from quiet observation to urgent concern. The question that echoed through policy circles was simple, but unsettling. Why would a law about seeds create this level of alarm? The answer reveals far more than agriculture. It exposes the struggle over who gets to define the future of an entire region. And this is where the story truly begins. To understand why global powers reacted so quickly, we need to look at what Burkina Faso placed inside this law, and why it strikes at interests far beyond its borders. To understand the reaction across the West, we need to look closely at what Burkina Faso actually did. The $900 million Anti-GMO Seed Law was not a symbolic statement or a political gesture. It was a complete redesign of how one nation planned to grow its food and defend its agricultural future. The law banned 4 major genetically modified seed strains tied to global biotech giants such as Monsanto and Bayer. These strains had been present in African farming for 2 decades, shaping how crops were planted, how fertilizer was used, and how farmers spent money every season. Under the new framework, Burkina Faso made a commitment that future seeds used within its borders must either come from local indigenous varieties or pass strict genetic transparency tests before entering the country. Border inspections were strengthened, research funding increased dramatically, and nearly $1 billion was designated for rebuilding seed banks that preserved varieties which existed long before patented biotech products reached the continent. For many farmers in the Sahel, this law addressed a quiet frustration that built up over years. GMO contracts often required annual seed purchases, specific chemical packages, and dependence on external suppliers. Families found themselves spending more each season while their soil grew weaker. In some regions, cotton yields once promised to rise instead fell sharply, leaving households in debt. The new law signaled that Burkina Faso would no longer accept a system that left rural communities struggling while foreign corporations dominated the market. A story from the northern province illustrates this turning point. A middle-aged farmer named Seba had spent years buying the same GMO cotton seeds because he believed they would increase his harvest. He followed every guideline the company gave him. He purchased the recommended fertilizer, used the right planting schedule, and adjusted his fields to meet the promised standards. After several seasons, he found his soil turning dry and thin. His yields fell. His family's savings ran low when the anti-GMO law passed. He told local radio that he finally felt he had the right to choose again. He said, "We lost control without realizing it. Now we are trying to take it back." His words were simple, but they captured the larger public mood. For an older American viewer, Seba's experience may not feel distant. Many recall years when small farmers across the United States struggled under changing markets, rising input costs, and policies that seemed designed far away from the people who lived with the consequences. That is why this law challenges more than economics. It touches on the question of who should decide what grows in the soil of a country. Families, corporations, or foreign governments. As Burkina Faso prepared to implement its reforms, scientists and researchers across the country began fieldwork to map native seed varieties that had nearly disappeared. Young biologists in Bobo Dioulasso spent evenings analyzing moisture levels and soil samples. Their goal was simple: find the seeds best suited to local conditions and bring them back into production. Many of these scientists said they wanted a future where African food systems answered first to the people who lived on the land, not to distant patent holders. Their work gave the law credibility and made the public feel that the change was grounded in science, not ideology. There is a moment in every nationwide reform when people begin to sense the scale of what is happening. In this case, it happened when farmers gathered around radios and phones to hear the official announcement. Some applauded, others grew emotional as they remembered the years when imported seeds promised higher yields but delivered debt and disappointment. An elder from Wahiguya said on air, "We lost the taste of our own land. Today, we begin to restore it." For a continent where farming has shaped identity for centuries, these words carried weight. If you are watching this and believe that people deserve the right to make their own agricultural choices, you can pause for a moment and reflect. Stories like these do not spread unless viewers choose to engage thoughtfully. Your attention keeps them alive. What makes this event so important is not only what Burkina Faso banned, but what it protected. A nation defended the biological foundation of its food system at a time when global agriculture is becoming more centralized. In doing so, it challenged the assumption that Africa will always rely on imported seeds and imported decisions. That is why this law triggered immediate concern among Western experts. But the question remains: if the law was designed to protect local farmers and rebuild self-reliance, why did officials in Washington and Brussels respond within hours of the vote? The answer lies in how this decision threatens long-standing economic and strategic interests in the West. And that is where the tension begins to rise. The real turning point arrived when the impact of the $900 million law reached the halls of power far beyond Burkina Faso. Once the vote passed, analysts inside the United States began treating the situation not as a local agricultural reform, but as a moment with the potential to shift decades of influence. Within 48 hours, emergency meetings were held in Washington with biotech executives, trade lawyers, and national security advisors. Internal notes from those meetings warned that if Africa continued moving toward indigenous seed systems, the United States would lose one of its most stable markets for genetically engineered crops. This concern was not just economic, it was strategic. For years, American agencies relied on agricultural partnerships as part of broader diplomatic and security frameworks across the Sahel. Losing that leverage raised questions about how future negotiations on aid, cooperation, and regional planning would unfold. For older American viewers, this type of shift may feel familiar. Many lived through periods when changes in agriculture led to major changes in politics and rural communities. When farming systems lose balance, entire regions feel the pressure. That is why Washington's reaction was so swift. A classified briefing circulated quietly, warning that the law could accelerate a long-term loss of influence in West Africa. One policy strategist put it plainly: if Africa moves together, we lose the ability to negotiate piece by piece. That sentence revealed the depth of concern behind closed doors. Across the Atlantic, European officials responded with equal urgency. Trade groups in Brussels requested a review under the World Trade Organization, arguing that the law could restrict European biotech products. French agricultural lobbies, long tied to West African markets, pressured their government to act before their influence slipped further. Commentators on European television described the vote in Burkina Faso as a break from the global agricultural system. To many Africans, these criticisms sounded like familiar echoes of decisions made about their land without their voice. To Western officials, they were signs that the balance of power was shifting faster than expected. As governments expressed concern, major biotech corporations stepped into the spotlight. 3 large firms issued coordinated statements warning that Burkina Faso's law could destabilize markets. Publicly, their language sounded reasonable. Privately, internal documents revealed deeper worry. These companies feared a chain reaction. If one African nation proved that indigenous seeds could sustain an entire farming system, others might follow. A leaked report suggested that some corporations were exploring options through the WTO dispute mechanism. The idea of dragging a small Sahel nation before an international tribunal over its seed policy sparked anger across the region. On social media, young agricultural engineers from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began posting videos of fields planted without imported seed stock. Universities released studies showing the resilience of pre-colonial crops. Farmers shared testimonies about how indigenous varieties survived harsh seasons long before genetic modification existed. Their message was clear: Africa was not rejecting science. It was rejecting dependence. During this period of rising tension, another voice emerged, one that carried weight far beyond its length. In a calm public address, Ibrahim Traoré stood at a simple wooden podium and said, "A nation that cannot control its seed cannot control its destiny." There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices. The clarity of his words unsettled many observers abroad. For citizens at home, it felt like a declaration of responsibility rather than defiance. Inside Burkina Faso, the emotional response grew stronger as the impact of the law became visible in everyday life. Families gathered in the cool evening air to discuss seed varieties their grandparents once planted. Women who had guarded family seeds for decades began teaching younger generations how to preserve them correctly. In schools, teachers introduced lessons about local crops, explaining that seeds tested over centuries carry both survival value and cultural meaning. These small moments created a sense of unity that political speeches alone could not achieve. If you are watching this and feel that every nation should have the right to decide how it grows its food, take a moment to reflect. The story unfolding here is not just about economics. It is about dignity, memory, and the belief that people can shape their own future. Your attention keeps discussions like this alive, especially for viewers who care about stability, family, and what it means to be responsible stewards of the land. As Western pressure tightened and African unity strengthened, the confrontation reached its most intense stage. Corporations feared losing patents. Governments feared losing influence. Citizens feared losing the chance to reclaim what they believed was theirs all along. And through all of this, a single question began to rise from both sides of the world. A question that sets the stage for what happens next. If control over seeds can shift power this quickly, what will be the consequences for society and politics inside Burkina Faso in the months ahead? As the $900 million seed law settled into daily life, the consequences inside Burkina Faso began unfolding in ways far deeper than economics. What started as a policy decision quickly became a social awakening. For the first time in a generation, people in villages, towns, and cities felt united around a single idea. Sovereignty begins in the soil. This belief touched families, schools, markets, activists, and even the country's long-divided political groups. In the rural north, families who once depended on imported seed packets began forming community circles to exchange ancestral varieties. These were not ceremonial gatherings. They were practical meetings where older farmers taught younger ones how to identify healthy millet or sorghum seeds, how to store them properly, and how to balance moisture during planting. A woman named Awa, who had preserved her family's seeds for more than 30 years, suddenly found herself at the center of these gatherings. She became a teacher for her neighbors, explaining the difference between seeds that grew strong roots and those weakened by generations of chemical dependence. When asked how she felt about the new law, she said simply, "We are learning to trust ourselves again." In marketplaces across towns like Kaya and Dori, traders spoke with pride about what they called the return of real millet and real sorghum. Shoppers recognized the flavors their grandparents once described. At the same time, small processing businesses began appearing, using local crops to produce flour, dried cereals, and traditional foods that had faded during the years of widespread GMO use. This revival of local products strengthened community economies and helped families keep income within their own regions. Schools also changed. Teachers introduced lessons about indigenous crops and how certain seed varieties survived droughts long before modern hybrids existed. Children learned that their country's agricultural identity was not something to be replaced, but something to be understood and protected. These lessons planted a sense of pride in communities that had long felt overshadowed by promises of external solutions. The political effects were equally striking. For years, civil society groups in Burkina Faso had been divided by ideology, generational differences, and debates over which direction the country should take. After the law passed, many of these groups shifted their focus toward practical discussions about irrigation, soil restoration, and seed preservation. Instead of arguing about parties or slogans, activists held workshops on drought-resistant planting methods and crop diversification. Even opposition leaders admitted publicly that the move toward local crops was now a national interest that rose above political competition. Inside the National Assembly, lawmakers received a surge of new proposals. Representatives pushed for policies that complemented the seed law, including regional water retention strategies, soil rehabilitation programs, and the creation of a Sahel-wide seed cooperation pact. These ideas collectively pointed toward something bigger than a single piece of legislation. They suggested that Burkina Faso was attempting a full redesign of its agricultural foundation, one that could influence neighboring countries for decades. If you are watching this from the United States, and you have lived through moments when rural communities depended on their own judgment, rather than outside instructions, you may recognize the importance of what is happening here. Agricultural independence does not guarantee safety, but it gives families the power to make decisions without waiting on distant organizations. If this resonates with you, take a moment to reflect. Stories of responsibility and renewal deserve thoughtful attention from those who understand the value of self-reliance. Economically, the transition was not without challenges. When rumors spread that certain Western buyers might reconsider contracts for Burkina Faso's cotton and sesame, the initial reaction could have been fear. Instead, it was determination. Citizens remembered years when dependency turned every planting season into a gamble. They chose to face short-term difficulty rather than return to a system where their country had little control over its harvest. One farmer said during a community meeting, "We have lived through worse storms. This time, at least we plant our own future." His words echoed across radio stations and gatherings throughout the Sahel. Meanwhile, the regional impact grew. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Ghana visited Burkina Faso to study the legal provisions in detail. Policymakers in these countries saw not only a blueprint for seed sovereignty, but a path toward political stability built on local strength. The idea that the Sahel could one day form a unified agricultural framework captured the attention of leaders, scholars, and farmers alike. As more communities embraced the shift, and more governments considered adopting similar models, the significance of the law became undeniable. Burkina Faso was no longer responding to global events. It was shaping them. But whenever a nation begins changing the balance of power, outside forces take notice, and the question lingered across the country. If seed sovereignty can reshape society at home, how will global powers respond when Africa starts turning agricultural independence into political independence? From the moment Burkina Faso passed its $900 million seed law, reactions inside the United States grew more complex than simple economic concern. American analysts began placing the decision within a broader pattern that has been developing for years. Food security, agricultural leverage, and geopolitical influence are deeply connected, and Washington understood that if Africa moved toward self-directed agriculture, decades of strategic advantage could weaken quickly. Internal briefings from the Department of Agriculture warned that American GMO exports had already suffered in disputes with China, Brazil, and India. Losing Africa, the fastest-growing agricultural market in the world, would accelerate what some officials described as a great decoupling, a slow but steady shift away from Western-controlled food systems. The Pentagon also took notice. Satellite assessments noted rising agricultural self-sufficiency in parts of the Sahel, a shift that could reduce Western leverage in future negotiations on security partnerships and regional cooperation. While public statements remained measured, the classified assessments were blunt. Burkina Faso's law functioned as a sovereignty multiplier. It tightened the country's control over its own resources and reduced the influence that larger powers once relied on. Across Europe, the reaction was just as tense. French agricultural groups expressed concern that their long-standing presence in West Africa might erode. German officials worried about losing future footholds for their biotechnology sector. In Brussels, policymakers explored whether the law qualified as a barrier to European certified agricultural products, signaling a potential conflict at the World Trade Organization. For older American viewers familiar with Western alliances, this reaction may feel familiar. When new policies threaten established systems, governments coordinate to defend their interests. Outside the West, however, the response carried a different tone. Analysts in India described Burkina Faso's move as a meaningful step toward decolonized food systems. In Brazil, agricultural experts noted that Africa's shift might signal the end of a global model built heavily around genetically engineered crops. Even China watched closely. While Beijing remained discreet, it saw opportunities to expand bilateral cooperation through irrigation technology, seed research, and non-GMO crop exchanges. If you are listening and believe that nations should have the right to decide how they grow their food, take a moment to consider how global reactions reveal deeper competition. Food policy is no longer local. It is part of a larger struggle over influence and independence. With so many powerful interests now involved, one question rises to the surface. If the world reacts this strongly to seed sovereignty, what happens when Africa begins extending this independence into trade, energy, and regional politics? What has unfolded in Burkina Faso after the $900 million seed law is not simply a change in agricultural policy. It is the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that reaches into community life, national identity, and the country's place in the world. For many citizens, the shift felt like the return of something long missing. Families began trusting their own traditions again. Scientists and farmers stood on the same side of the conversation. Young people saw a future shaped by local strength rather than dependency. The law did more than redefine how a nation plants its fields. It reintroduced the idea that control, dignity, and responsibility can grow from the soil upward. But with every new direction comes a warning. Global powers will not ignore a movement that threatens established systems. Pressure will come in forms that may not be obvious at first. Trade disputes could intensify. Aid programs might be reshaped. Diplomatic language could become more rigid, and attempts to divide African countries through selective partnerships are almost certain. If the Sahel's push for seed sovereignty gains momentum, it will challenge economic structures that have defined global agriculture for decades. The next 3 years are critical. If Africa stays united, the shift could become irreversible. If countries are isolated or pressured individually, the movement may slow before reaching its full potential. For American viewers who care about stability, fairness, and the responsibility each nation holds to its people, this moment raises important questions. What does it mean when a country decides to stand on its own feet? What does it mean when farmers try to shape their children's future instead of waiting for promises from abroad? And what does it say about our own values when another nation's pursuit of dignity is seen as a threat? If this story touched you, pause for a moment and reflect on what it means for any nation to reclaim something as basic as its seeds. Consider what families gain when they are allowed to shape their own harvests, their own choices, and their own identity. If you believe in justice, responsibility, and the right of every community to define its future, let your thoughts be part of this conversation. Share what this moment means to you. These reflections help keep important stories alive. As Burkina Faso prepares for the seasons ahead, one question stands above all the others. Will Africa's rise through agriculture become the defining shift of this century, or will global powers find a way to hold the line? For now, the world is watching, and history is being written in fields where families plant seeds with their own hands and their own hope.